Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Character Day with the Moxie Institute. I'm Arnie Johnson. I'm one of the editors for Moxie Institute. Sawyer.
I'm Sawyer Steele, and I co-write and produce the films with Tiffany Schlane, who is bopping about at different events today. She's actually on her way to her daughter's middle school for a screening and event, so that's really wonderful. And we have Rabbi Jordan, and you say your last name again.
Bendat Appell.
Bendat Appell, who was a wonderful, wonderful advisor on the making of Mensch. And so Character Day, we have 3 films available. Hopefully you out there have seen at least one of them, and if not all 3. We have The Making of a Mensch, The Adaptable Mind, and The Science of Character. And they're all about 10 minutes long. They're all free at letripple.org or characterday.org. And we are here today with Jordan to talk primarily about The Making of a Mensch and Mussar and sort of our journey towards understanding more about Mussar and using Jordan as a resource there. And we have questions already coming in. So you can ask your questions by going on Twitter and hashtag Character Day, all one word, and ask any question you want to Jordan, to us, to Character Day in general. And we'll be watching for that. And you can also do the same thing on Facebook, hashtag Character Day. And you can also ask questions in this Google Hangout. If you can find the Q&A, good for you, and ask us questions there. And I'm gonna hand it over to Arnie here.
So Jordan, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself? Sawyer's given some great background about how you helped to contribute to the film. But we would love to hear a little bit about what your background is and how it fits in with what we're doing today.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure and honor, really, to be with you. Let's see. I really grew up in a secular Jewish home outside of Chicago, not really having much of any spiritual life to speak of. Until early on in college, I got interested in Buddhism and meditation, and it's a whole long story, but that eventually led me really back into my birth tradition of Judaism. And I have been really fortunate to have the opportunity to engage in Jewish spiritual practice really full-time now as a rabbi. I work for the Institute for Jewish Spirituality primarily, which is a wonderful organization based out of New York. And we offer training programs and standalone conferences and other retreats for folks who want to deepen really their experience of Jewish spiritual practices, Jewish mindfulness practice, prayer, study. We typically don't call it Mussar, we call it more Tikkun Midot, which is a related kind of approach. Tikkun Midot meaning fixing or healing qualities. And I also do local work around Chicago for another organization called Orot, Center for New Jewish Learning. And we offer different kinds of programs in Jewish meditation, in text study. And we're actually we're looking to begin some Mussar work as well around Chicago. So this stuff is really close to my heart and is really a centerpiece, both of my personal life, but also my professional life.
Great.
Oh, and I should also say that in rabbinical school, I had the great honor of studying with Rabbi Ira Stone in an intensive 2-year program in Mussar. And it's been really interesting because I came into that more from kind of a meditative approach, and it has been really, I think, quite healthy for me to figure out an integration of those 2 different approaches, sort of a Jewish mindfulness approach and a Mussar approach, which is something I'm really interested in how those approaches can work together.
So the question that everybody's asking, Mussar or Mussar?
You know, you hear it pronounced differently from different folks. I think, you know, traditionally in the more like yeshivish world, the world of the traditional yeshiva, you often hear Mussar, but more of the kind of contemporary, more Israeli Hebrew pronunciation would be Mussar.
Jordan, I'm really curious. When in the making of a Mensch, one of the things that was sort of the excitement about making this film was offering the idea of Mussar to the rest of the world, not just the Jewish community, as a sort of a practice. And I'm curious because it sounds like you've investigated, Buddhism, a lot of different spiritual practices that people use who maybe aren't even religious, who are secular, like people meditate or people use yoga. Do you feel like there's something in Mussar or in Tikkun Midot, which you've been working on, that is like, 20 years down the line or something, you could see people saying, I'm going to my Mussar class, somebody who isn't Jewish, or, and then I'm going to my yoga class later, or do you see that as something that can fit into the sort of like pantheon of spiritual practices that people can do regardless of their religious background?
I love that question. I think so. And I think, kind of a Mussar approach that would work for folks who aren't Jewish, or I should say, quite honestly, Jews who have all kinds of different theological assumptions and orientations. I think a Mussar approach that would work for those folks is an approach that would really need to be, I think, a bit more agnostic theologically, and to really emphasize the kind of the bottom line, which is that of practice and that of engaging in this human experience with intention. Some approaches within the Mussar tradition are very theologic. They're really rooted in certain theological assumptions. And so if you share those assumptions, or if you're inclined to share those assumptions, then they work. But if you have a different theological orientation, whether you're Jewish or not, you're going to run into some trouble. That being said, I think the fundamental insight of Mussar, which is that we can change, that we can grow as human beings, that is not a Jewish thing, or even a particular that doesn't belong to a particular framework within Judaism. I mean, that's really human. And so I do love thinking about that. I hadn't thought about it until you asked the question, what would it look like to have a kind of, some kind of Mussar or Tikkun Midot approach that really draws from the richness of Mussar tradition, but that it's clearly for everybody. And I think the key to that would be just really clarifying what theological assumptions are necessary for engaging in this work. And my guess is that people would have different understandings of that. Maybe I'll just say one more thing about that, which is that, there's somewhat of a paradigm shift happening within within religions and within the kind of the world of spiritual practice, which is that, folks are really connecting to the idea that we can engage in these kinds of practices. We can have rich spiritual lives, whether it's in a Jewish paradigm or a Buddhist one or something else, that is really focused on working with one's experience, and is less so about receiving a dogma, believing certain things, that there's a kind of, the element of practice is held up as more primary than belief. So I think that's something that's really kind of coming through for many, many people in many different areas.
One of the interesting things to me about Jewish culture in general, and to a certain extent Jewish religion, is that there is a fair amount of room and interest in other spiritualities. Some of the great thinkers about, meditation and Buddhism and translators of these works have been Jewish. And I'm curious about your thoughts about that sort of linkage, because you sound like you're sort of in the center of that. What is there in the sort of Jewish tradition that is more embracing than some other religions are, or, of spiritual strains that are not necessarily Jewish or related directly to Judaism? And I know that's not true for all factions of Judaism, obviously, but there is a sort of grand tradition within the Jewish practice of incorporating or being interested or in investigating other practices.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, let me approach that question in two different ways. The first is to say, just to really underline your point, that I think when we have when we take an honest assessment of the history of Jewish thought, Jewish spiritual practice, we see clearly a strong influence on the formation of what might eventually become, normative Jewish practices, like, like the Seder, the Passover Seder, which is has such strong influence from Roman and Greek banquets. Or you think about the thought of somebody like Maimonides, who was so strongly influenced by Greek philosophical thought. You see how these outside non-Jewish influences really find their ways into Judaism. And even like Bachya ibn Pakuda, who is mentioned in the film, his major work, Chovot HaLevavot, Duties of the Heart, is really looks just like Sufi texts coming from Spain at the same time. So we see how there's naturally a kind of interplay, a dialogue, whether overt or covert, happening between Jewish thinkers and non-Jewish thinkers throughout time. And that happens, in every religion, I would say. So that's like one side of it. But I think, another side of it is that people within, traditional religious frameworks often resist that idea and are kind of glom onto a notion of purity more. Which I think is doesn't necessarily hold up intellectually when you really probe it. Now, that being said, I think that Jews have been drawn in the last 30 years, 40 years to Eastern practices, particularly, not because Judaism encouraged them to do it, but because people were not finding what they needed within Judaism. So, it's certainly been my experience when I was really getting into Zen and Tibetan Buddhism that I was just amazed at, when I would read lists of prominent Buddhist teachers, it really sounded like, who was at the men's club or the women's club at the synagogue. I mean, when you hear the last names. And so, it's an amazing phenomenon that the number of people have started to look at and are interested in, what is it about Buddhism that was drawing all these amazing Jewish thinkers and teachers into Buddhism. And I think there's a lot to be said for really honestly admitting that for a number of years, Judaism was simply not providing the spiritual sustenance that we Jewish human beings needed. And so people were looking elsewhere. And so now that we're at a different point, I think today, in which we have the great benefit of being able to engage in Jewish spiritual practices like Mussar, like Jewish meditation, Jewish mindfulness, and other things in which we can, I think, be a bit more honest about, drawing from the richness of non-Jewish sources, whether from more religious or spiritual traditions like Buddhism, but also from neuroscience and other more secular and often psychological sources to enrich our understanding of what it means to practice something as a Jewish practice. To me, that's really exciting. Not to have to pretend like I have no Buddhist influences, not to have to pretend like I'm not interested in psychology or neuroscience, but rather, one in which I can embrace that as part of my Jewish practice.
Which is actually a perfect segue into a question that we have from Twitter, which is any advice on a good place to begin to incorporate some of these practices into one's life?
I would definitely, I would encourage people to seek out local teachers or to look at organizations that do training programs and offer retreats in these kinds of practices. And I can, happy to mention some, I would for sure encourage people to check out the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, who I work for, jewishspirituality.org. The Mussar Institute, which was started by Alan Marinis, also mentioned in the film. There are also many great books that are out there. Everyday Holiness by Alan Marinis. I also, just kind of a plug for two of my favorite books by the same author, Rabbi Alan Liu of blessed memory, who is a teacher of mine. And he was really, in many ways, a pioneer and a visionary in speaking about Jewish spiritual practice, specifically within meditation. But I think there's tremendous overlap in terms of how to think about these, a kind of a Jewish meditation orientation within a larger framework of Jewish spiritual practice. It would certainly inform and be helpful with the Mussar practice. And his books I would recommend are Be Still and Get Going. Again, his name is Alan Liu, L-E-W. And also a book that's really, because we're in this season of the high holidays, his book, This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared, which is all about engaging in the cycle of this season really as a spiritual practice. I think reading books like these that I mentioned are super helpful, but they're really no substitute for engaging in these kinds of practices on one's own and with a community that can support it. So anybody who's interested, I would really encourage them to seek out fellow travelers. I know in my own experience, there's no substitute for engaging in practice with other folks.
Well, that's a great segue into another question we have from our audience. What are some of the specific Mussar practices, and which of those can be for everyone?
Great. I think one specific approach within Mussar that I think is really applicable to everyone is really starts with what we would call cheshbon nefesh, which means a soul accounting. And I think, to really begin from a place of honest looking at qualities that one really manifests as honestly as we can, not trying to figure out, how did I once, make manifest the quality of, gratitude or patience, but rather, again, as honestly as I can to bear witness to where I am in regards to a given quality, in regards to how I am in the world. And then the thing that comes next is so crucial, and is again a kind of like foundational insight of Mussar, which is that we go from an honest awareness of where we're at, and then what we can try to do is actually do practices that help to develop, really build the muscles, like to train ourselves in the qualities that we hope to make manifest in the world. So for example, if I notice when I'm doing this kind of soul accounting, who am I really? And I recognize that I am just not a patient person, or I realize I'm not a grateful person, or I'm not as grateful as I once was, then what I can then start to do is to engage in practices that specifically work to develop those qualities. So maybe I say, I'm gonna, every night before I go to bed, I'm gonna write down 5 things I'm grateful for, and I can only repeat, 1 or 2 of them from day to day. So I'm like exercising the gratitude muscles. And research has shown that these kinds of simple practices actually help to cultivate the qualities of heart and mind that we hope to develop. And so we can really change our brains on a neurological level and change the patterns from which we engage in the world. And so I think, again, we look honestly and then we respond to it by using repetition and practices that can, in small incremental ways, help to develop the muscles, the kind of spiritual, personality muscles that we hope to develop.
Wonderful. And we're right at our time here, and I feel like we could keep going, but do you have anything?
I had one follow-up
yeah.
if we have time for
Please.
it. I was just curious, one of the interesting things we were talking about, kind of developing the muscle for these practices. And I know that in some spiritual thought or conversation, that there's this sort of dividing line between waiting for inspiration to motivate you, like, and then, or practicing goodness or practicing stuff, and then spirit comes to you sort of through these acts. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that dynamic, because you talked earlier about this sort of craving for more spirituality in Jewish practice in general, that led people maybe to go to Buddhism, and stuff like that. And that I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about where those things meet, sort of the difference between practice, or maybe you don't feel spirit in you yet, but if you do this every day, eventually you get there. Or do you want to be doing something that doesn't feel like it's spiritually centered until do you understand what I'm asking? Like, there's a sort of dynamic between just putting one foot out the door and starting down that path. Maybe you're not sure yet, but walking can make that happen.
It's great. Yeah, it's a dynamic that I think about quite a bit. To paraphrase a quote I heard in a Buddhist context, I think awakening is, in many ways, can be understood as an accident, but the practice makes us accident prone. And
Nice.
I really love that, and it resonates very, very much with my personal experience. That as a human being who's in the world, we will have experiences of peace, of happiness, of connection, of a sense of stillness, etc., of wakefulness. But I personally, I don't want to wait until I just stumble into these things occasionally. I want to live a life that is as rich, as meaningful, as vibrant, and connected to my highest sense of who I can be in the world as possible. And so, like Abraham Joshua Heschel said that, most of us have an awareness of our proximity to the ultimate, as he said, when we are face to face with mortality. And he says that Judaism is the attempt to instill in us that kind of awareness as an everyday practice. And so by engaging in day-to-day practices that might seem mundane, might seem even like silly or somehow disconnected from our big purpose, what we're really doing is preparing ourselves to be, really to be accident prone, so that we can stumble into those experiences of calm, of experience of feeling awake, and a sense of joy that comes not from achieving everything, but can simply flow from being awake with this breath and in this moment of life. And so there really is a kind of active dynamic between cultivating these things in an active way, and then also allowing for the kind of possibility of just walking into them, and that these things do arise naturally in the course of living. And when those things happen and when they come, to really embrace them and to build upon those experiences.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jordan.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And thanks everybody who's out there asking questions and watching and participating. And we look forward to more Google Hangouts. And Jordan, we hope to see or hear questions from you later if you have them for other people.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much.
And also just for those who are interested in, just to repeat what Jordan was saying, if you're interested in these practices, Jordan is part of the Jewish mindfulness tradition. And what was the name of the organization that you work with again, that seemed like a good source for people to touch base with if they're interested?
Yeah, it's called the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. JewishSpirituality.org is our website. And then also around the Chicago area, I work for an organization called Orot, Center for New Jewish Learning, and that is orotcenter.org if you're in Chicago. So great organizations. Yeah.
Thank you, Jordan.
Excellent. Thank you for your mind and wonderfulness.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Have a great day.
Bye, everybody. Shabbat shalom, and have a great holiday.
Shabbat shalom.
Bye-bye.